50% of women abandon their careers in tech by the age of 35.
We think that's unacceptable, and it's exactly why we started this podcast.
I'm Jo Keneally, tech veteran and writer.
And I'm Jarisha Nadaraju, product ops leader and startup advisor.
We're The Other Half, a podcast for ambitious women navigating their way.
This episode is brought to you by PCX Pay, helping businesses move money across borders with speed, clarity, and control. Simplify your payments infrastructure at pcxpay.com. We've partnered with Clue for Season 3 of The Other Half. Clue is the science-backed period and cycle tracking app that helps you understand your body, from cycle predictions and hormone insights to fertility tracking and mood patterns. As a listener of The Other Half, you have exclusive access to a whole free year of Clue Plus. Just head to the link in the show notes to claim it.
In this episode, we're joined by Chiara Kunnie, Manager of Digital Sales Social Impact at Twilio. We discuss navigating career changes, what tech for good really means, and why impact and ambition are not opposites.
Chiara, welcome to the Other Half podcast. We are so excited to have you on today. How are you doing?
Thank you, Jarisha and Jo. It's really great to be a part of the Other Half podcast. I've been following the journey that you guys have created, and honestly, very excited to be here and share a little bit more of our story.
Yeah, Chiara, I have known Chiara for the longest time. I think over 20 years. And so it's amazing to be able to speak to you and I think ask you questions that I've never asked you before in the entire time that I've known you. So I'm quite excited for that. So let's go into the first question, which is, Chiara, you started your career in investment banking in South Africa, and then you made the significant pivot to work at the intersection of sort of social impact and tech in the UK. You know, that's quite a bold move, and I think professionally and then maybe also financially, potentially. So what prompted that transition? You know, was there a single moment, or was it something that built up for you over time?
Yeah, that really takes me back about almost 10 years. It was a gradual build-up for me. As you know, I spent almost the first decade of my career in investment banking and finance, which I absolutely loved, and I thought it was a really good grounding for me. I learned about rigor. I learned about how companies operate at scale because it was with HSBC, which is a global bank. Yeah, and so I think from that perspective, I started to feel, I had a bit of an inflection point where I started to feel like I wanted to put my skills to more meaningful use. I wanted to be connected to human impact and do more to help people with the skills that I had already built over this first half of my career. And so I started exploring options, and I came across mission-driven organizations that were operating at the intersection of technology and social impact. And within those organizations, I found roles where I could meaningfully apply my skills, use my business background towards more purposeful outcomes. And since then, I've spent the last decade working at companies specifically that build communication platforms and tools like messaging, voice for public sector and nonprofits to help get information and support to people who need it the most. So that could be, for example, accessing healthcare information or booking medical appointments, or even supporting communities who are navigating conflict and crises and who are trying to stay safe and informed. So I guess going back to your question, it wasn't a sudden pivot for me, is more of a gradual rewrite, if you would, a reorientation of my skill set towards a different set of problems, but that still allowed me to feel like I was connecting my skills more to human impact.
That's so interesting, Chiara, and I can identify with that feeling of, you know, like working in finance or working in a certain industry, and then you hit a point where it's sort of like, well, you know, what am I doing? I guess it's that thing of like, what is my purpose? Am I directing my skills towards the thing that is fulfilling to me, or where I feel that I'm actually having the impact that I want to? Yeah. So it sounds like it was a gradual build up, but then you focused on the sort of like, you said you researched sort of mission focused companies and tried to find places where you'd have impact. But that could be so many different things. And it feels like you've gone into almost like this, no, I wouldn't say niche, but then you ended up really looking at the sort of like almost like this communication element when it came to social impact. Did that just happen organically, or were you thinking that's the angle that you wanted to, or area you wanted to get into within social impact?
No, I would say it happened by accident, to be quite honest. And the reason such a funny story, my last day on the job at HSBC, I bumped into somebody and they asked me, "What are you going to do now?" And I said, "I don't know. I just know that I wanted to direct my career towards social innovation." And there is so much that you can do within social innovation, from healthcare to education, etc. And she said, "Well, you should check out this company. My friend works there." And that is how I came to learn of Reach Digital Health, which is a tech nonprofit in Johannesburg. And they had some roles available where I could apply and direct my business background. And they were building messaging platforms for information and support to help people get access to the help they needed. And I think that was really by accident that I found them. And since then, it's just been a natural transition of either still staying within messaging, still staying within the communication field, and now more recently in my current role, really expanding beyond that to voice technology and AI and even email. So there is so much within the communication for good space. And I think overall, I didn't anticipate going down this direction, but it's been incredibly fulfilling for me. And I can also see the real impact of the communication in the work that you do, and just hearing back from the communities that are using these types of platforms.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't actually know that that's how you ended up going into that. Yeah, and then you said it happened by accident, but I think for a lot of people who intentionally decide, because you made the decision to quit or stop your job in finance, right? And then you knew that you wanted to go into this area. And I think for a lot of people, once they're at that stage and they voice that out loud, because you said to her, "I don't know, but I'm interested in this." And then she then told you, like, "Oh, what about this company?" So it's almost like you've taken the action and you've put it out there, and then you get this sort of direction, into something that it could end up being, which is very cool. But I know that you also went back to do an MBA. So you went back to university, you ended up at Cambridge doing your MBA there after your career in banking and finance. And you specialized in social innovation. What did that experience give you that you couldn't have got on the job?
I think I wanted and this is why I chose specifically to do an MBA at this point, is I wanted that academic grounding and academic understanding of social innovation. And in fact, the Cambridge MBA is associated with the Center for Social Innovation. There is quite a specific arm of the MBA that focuses on social impact and doing good well. And through that process, I was able to understand how impact gets designed, how it gets funded, how it gets scaled. So it was very much connecting the theory to the industry, the theory to the practice. And then going one step beyond that, it allows you to also see it in practice. The Cambridge is also known as the Silicon Fen, which you might be aware of. It's an incredible startup ecosystem with, founders, researchers, early stage startups that are solving very real world problems. And being in that hub is incredibly energizing and inspiring, and also sparking the ideas of what does it mean to be a social enterprise. Another thing that really was one of the key takeaways for me was the network, which I'm sure, you having done your Oxford MBA, you're walking away with this incredible experience of having learned from a whole entirely global group of people that you otherwise would not have met. And it also gave me the opportunity to actually practically work with global organizations like the World Health Organization, whom I first met on the MBA and found incredible mentors and leaders there. And then I went on to collaborate several times with the WHO throughout my career. But also, I think just taking an entire step back from actually tangibly, what am I walking away with? Most importantly, I think it was just a year of investing in myself. I threw myself into anything and everything social impact related in that year. So, you're operating this space where you don't have the day-to-day sort of delivery of being in a job. You're able to actually spend time challenging your thinking, pushing your boundaries, and building confidence to sort of navigate the unknown. And that brings you to a real inflection point, and it allowed me to really try to hone in on the kind of career that I wanted to build.
That is really interesting. And I love how you almost took that experimental mindset when you were in the MBA of just like, let's try everything social impact. I'm curious to know because I feel like actually I'm very similar to you in some ways in that I started my career with a like sustainability social focus. I wanted to go save the world, got a little bit disillusioned with ticking boxes, pivoted into tech, and now I find myself kind of thinking about how do I actually bring those skill sets together again between like, tech, things I've learned, and doing well in the world. But I can imagine there was, well, and you tell me, sometimes when people do MBAs or come to this mid career point, you do start thinking about money, material considerations, and especially after having done an MBA, I'm sure you had lots of options available to you. Was there a point where you were tempted to maybe go back to that corporate career, or how did you decide that actually staying on that social innovator path was for you?
That's a good question. I think in that moment, what I wanted to make sure I did was stay true to working in social impact. When I say working in social impact, that could mean working in a nonprofit, or it could mean working in the social impact arm of a company. Could it mean working in corporate social responsibility? Fundamentally, that was what I knew to be true. That was the thread that I wanted when I was trying to decide what next. I know a lot of folks in my class were really keen on consulting, for example, and there were many opportunities to apply for consulting roles. I definitely knew what I didn't want to do post the MBA. And I knew that whatever I wanted to do after, it wasn't necessarily, was it a big corporate or a small nonprofit, but a small startup that I wanted to work at. I just knew that I wanted to find a role that was focused on social impact, and that would be the path that would ground me. And so that was sort of what I was assessing. I was doing a number of informational chats with people across various different companies and organizations to see what would be the right fit. And ultimately, I actually chose to return to Reach Digital Health. From that year I was away, they had accelerated so much in their journey with using and building tech for good. And it was a fantastic point for me to go back into a more senior role, leveraging the skills that I had just built through the MBA, and also leveraging the network I built MBA, because very soon after that, we actually started working with the WHO during the pandemic, where we were spinning up healthcare chatbots on WhatsApp for the WHO when COVID was first announced as a global pandemic, and then going on to build chatbots for ministries of health and other healthcare agencies. So it was a really good choice for me to go to return to Reach, to also be on their growth path and trajectory as an organization, and allowed me to really build a good grounding to take my career to the next step at a larger tech company thereafter.
It just sounds like you had good intuition or instincts about what you wanted, and that social thread, like knowing that as your kind of North Star, it really helped you open up different avenues. Speaking of COVID and pandemics, though, it was probably a very interesting time to really focus on social innovation and like just social impact technology, because across your career you have worked with organizations deploying technology to manage global crises such as pandemics and war. What does it take to execute like something of that magnitude under pressure? And also, how do you think about the responsibility that comes with deploying technology in that context that can be very dangerous, or just sometimes life or death?
Well, I'm gonna maybe split those questions into two parts because I think they're quite different, and it's really important to give a good context and a full, robust answer to both. I think in terms of your first question, yes, operating in that kind of environment where the pace and the pressure is incredibly different is intense. And I think the first thing that I learned in those moments was really to just stay calm under pressure. These types of environment, in these moments, people are seeking clarity and they're seeking stability. So being able to think clearly and not be reactive is really important. Secondly, you have to stay nimble. Things are adapting so quickly. They're evolving sometimes hour by hour. So you yourself have to be willing to adapt, have to be willing to reassess and even pivot while still trying to have that single-threaded goal in sight of what you want to achieve. And then finally, with any sort of situation that is ambiguous, communication is everything. So communicating early, often, and with transparency is incredibly important when you don't have all the answers because they have not yet revealed themselves and you don't even know how long this is going to last or how far it's going to go. Keeping people aligned and informed is what allows the coordinated action to actually even happen. And then to answer your second question, which I think is, and this just to say, all of these views are my own, responsibility becomes exponentially higher when you are in a high stakes or humanitarian context, because the cost of getting it wrong is not just inconvenience. You could be affecting people's lives. You could be affecting people's safety and their access to resources. So if there is a crisis situation where communication platforms are being deployed, they have to be secure, reliable, and resilient. And everybody who is involved, every stakeholder who is delivering those services have a responsibility to think carefully about things like safety, misuse, and privacy. But the challenge in those situations is that time is limited. So you actually can't build robust systems and safeguards entirely on the fly. And therefore, there's a lot of work that goes into developing these things beforehand, before the emergency itself. So making sure that it's rooted in user-centric frameworks, building in guardrails, making sure that you're creating escalation protocols and that you're also stress testing the system to limit misuse or limit vulnerabilities. And then you can tailor those foundations to the context and to the crisis as it unfolds. Arguably, I think one of the most important things in times of crisis or natural disasters, humanitarian contexts, is the fact that disinformation and misinformation spreads rapidly. And that erodes trust, which is an absolute non-negotiable when it comes to crisis response. So a large question, and in fact, front of mind, we should be thinking about how can trust be protected and how can it be upheld in a situation where trust and safety is actually completely broken. So when I think about just sort of deploying tech responsibly in these situations, it's not a matter of if we should use messaging or voice services, because we have seen the value in those situations of using those types of tools, but rather how do we mitigate risk? How do we protect trust while also making sure that we're continuing to adapt safeguards as the threats evolve and as the disinformation evolves through that situation.
That is super interesting. On that trust point, is that evolving question, or are there, how do you think about that? Or is there a way of solving that upfront, or do you just have to build it over the long term with the relationships you're building on the ground?
Yeah, I think trust is built beforehand, before the actual emergence of the situation. And so making sure that you're working with organizations that have a local presence, that have built the trust ahead of time with the local community, and not sort of parachuting in some sort of golden bullet of technology, which does not exist. Technology is not a silver bullet, is really important. trust can be so fragile. And so making sure that you are always putting the person that you're trying to support and serve at the heart of the technology that you're trying to build is how you make sure they have agency in the process and how you make sure that you're actually building trust through the process. So I think it comes down to working hand in hand with the communities and the people that you are trying to support, or that the organization is trying to support, having them also collaboratively design the solution that is going to serve them best.
Makes a lot of sense. And I do think the tech industry, as optimistic and pro it as I am at times, it can be a little bit, to use your phrase, it can want to parachute in with solutions that perhaps work in Silicon Valley but don't necessarily translate to the rest of the world sometimes. You've worked in lots of different contexts now. We mentioned pandemics, of course, but also I think around education and financial inclusion. And these are areas where technology has enormous potential, but to your point on, again, parachuting in, can have quite a complicated history. What does tech for good mean to you? And how do you think about tech being used for good that is actually effective versus just being performative?
Yes, it's a very fine line, but I think the key difference when you're really trying to consider what is impactful tech for good is whether it's actually going to change outcomes or is it just creating that appearance of impact. And I think the most transformative work will happen when you're considering a real problem, one that has actually been validated, one where people are genuinely struggling with an issue instead of just trying to slap a shiny piece of technology onto a use case and hoping that it works. Tech for good has to be fit for purpose. It has to meet an actual need, number one. And then I think when you think about the performative tech for good, sometimes they, might try to optimize for visibility, as opposed to actual outcomes. Because in reality, some of the most impactful solutions aren't really very glamorous. The actual, impact might just be incremental. It's improving daily life at scale in small ways. It might mean that you're reducing the administrative burden for healthcare workers, or you're improving access to services, or you're saving people time and money, and ensuring that you're able to track that impact through monitoring and evaluation or learning and making sure that you're continuously improving and adding to or contributing to the body of evidence is key to really meaningfully defining impact in the industry. And I think you also touched on sort of the complicated nature of really impactful tech. And I think that really comes down to power and who's involved. And I touched on this in the earlier question, but truly impactful work is designed with the communities, not just for the communities. And that also allows for organizations to take into account key issues like agency and also mitigating bias. And then I will just say something that's really an important consideration is true impact is one that is sustainable beyond a pilot. And that often means investing in partnerships with local communities, as we mentioned, with local governments, so that you're able to embed the tech for good solution into the national system for real long-term value delivery and long-term systems change. And that's what I believe is really truly impactful tech for good.
That's such a strong and intentional and considered answer, Chiara. Just the way you've explained that. I was taking down notes as you were speaking, but a lot of the things you were saying kind of resonated with me working in product. So it is a bit of that very product-minded approach, but taking a truly, thinking about your users or your customers, understanding their problem statement, validating it, and then that iterative approach of actually, what can we do to, in a small way, improve it? For me, the biggest thing you were saying, even as you were starting to talk about the small ways you can improve it, I was thinking, well, how do you measure that? Because you need to be able to reflect that back to whoever it is. They need to know that the thing that you're doing is working. So I love that you touched on actually think about designing it such that you can even measure the small increments of improvement that are coming through. But yeah, and then the pilot, it needs to live beyond a pilot, because obviously how are you going to actually have real impact? You can't just do a one-off thing. You need to embed it and actually have it there. And, it's probably going to take time before you can see all of those results. So yeah, it just came through as being truly, in a way, product minded and focusing on your customers and your users. And that's maybe the thing to keep at the heart of it as you are approaching tech for good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, when you're really working closely with people and trying to have a real impact and working alongside them, the most crucial part is the design and what you're doing up front, because it's not something that you can go back and fix. So you really have to build with design and scale and impact in your mind from the start.
I think you've also done a really good job of explaining tech for good in a way that, I think people can sometimes be quite dismissive of tech for good and social impact within the tech space. There's all of this thing, but there is a lot to consider and a lot that goes into actually getting it right. And the stakes, in a way, at least with some of the things you're doing, are way higher than some of the stuff that people are working on day to day, or at least I've been exposed to, in previous companies. So yeah, it has a lot of gravitas, and weight to it in the work that you're doing. So thank you for explaining that. You are now the manager of digital sales for social impact at Twilio, which is a huge, amazing organization. You're in a sales focused position, which I can imagine. I don't know if this is accurate. You can let me know, but I can imagine it must come with revenue targets and commercial accountability and potentially quotas and things like that. So that feels like it's a very different kind of pressure from some of the other, your previous experience in tech for good, which was more maybe partnerships related or impact led roles that you've had before. How has it felt stepping into this more conventional commercial role, and was that a deliberate choice? What drew you to it?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I think this is something that might be, maybe it's a misconception with partnerships roles, in that they maybe are perceived as being less commercially focused than sales. I think throughout my career, in reality, whenever had impact focused roles, or worked in business development or partnerships, I've always had targets tied to things like revenue, usage, growth, adoption. The sales cycle certainly looks different, perhaps, to partnerships, which in partnerships, it tends to be longer term, but there has always been accountability tied to outcomes. And there's a lot of similarities. So there are a lot of partnerships principles that translates into sales. So you're still trying to build a relationship together to achieve a shared goal. You're still acting as a trusted advisor, trying to understand an organization's challenges, working together to create impact. And as a leader, you're still trying to elevate, empower, and support a team. I would say the difference here that I've really leaned into is that there is more rigor in the sales motion. It's definitely more analytical, but that has been it's actually very much aligned well to my analytical approach and naturally how I think and work. I'm very driven by business outcomes that are measurable, and I am very driven by mission-led impact. And this role allows me to operate at the intersection of both. But I will say, ever since I transitioned into the tech for good space, I've been partnering with organizations that are using communication platforms to reach people in need. And that underlying mission has remained consistent for me, regardless of the title that I have. So it actually feels like a very natural transition.
I love that you said that, it sort of helped bring these two sides of yourself together, which is, that you are somebody who is analytical and is driven by also the business outcomes and even having these targets and these numbers and these things to work towards. I guess, does it make you feel like you're under more pressure, or is it just different?
Perhaps in some way. I think it depends on how often the targets are measured. So in partnerships, it was a little bit more of a longer lead time. So we looked sometimes semi-annually and annually versus quarterly. So I guess the pressure is just sort of different time scales that you're looking at, but it's a different type of pressure. I would say it's probably the same amount of pressure I've experienced in different ways throughout my career. So not as different as one would think. I definitely, yeah, not as different as one as one would think.
Okay, I'm just curious because I haven't been in, sort of commercial type roles before in tech. I mean, I used to work in like investment banking, but not in the tech world. So I'm curious about that. Sherry, you might have touched on this already because I was going to ask you about how do you hold both, which is hitting this number that you are going to have to do, or being asked to do as being part of the sales team, but then genuinely believing in the impact of what you're selling.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because you feel like they might be at odds with one another. But I think whether you're working at a non-profit tech company or a for-profit tech company, you are still ultimately working towards a goal. So, as we shared, it could be a fundraising goal if you're working at a nonprofit, it could be a reach metric. And I think, I've seen how communication platforms can impact and change the lives of the people that are using it. And so I genuinely believe in the value of that work in these platforms because we have seen the outcomes firsthand. We've heard directly from the people and the communities, and sometimes that impact is incredibly tangible. Like I said, saving people time, for example, helping organizations deliver support more effectively. And because of that, I've never approached sales as trying to convince people to buy something. I've always approached it as if I am building a partnership that is built on trust and that is led by empathy. Trying to understand what an organization is trying to achieve and then trying to even figure out whether your solution is actually going to genuinely help them to do that better. But it does unlock a bit of a philosophical question for me in my mind. And I will say, I think it goes back to your question about that revenue and that impact. I actually don't think it's mutually exclusive. I sometimes think that there might be a perception that in certain fields, that monetization somehow undermines purpose. But actually, sustainable funding models are often what allows the impact to continue long term beyond the pilot. Organizations, no matter if they're nonprofit or large corporate, they will budget for things like infrastructure, operations, and software because that those are essential to delivering programs effectively. Technology is no different. There is investment that goes into building, maintaining, securing, and even just evolving these platforms over time. And so having that be already baked into a budget cycle for a nonprofit is part and parcel of how they also do business and run their operations. And in fact, social enterprises are a really great example of this done well. They have profit and purpose within a single business model. And they recognize that generating revenue isn't the opposite of impact. It's in fact what enables that impact to scale and to endure. So in that instance, profit actually becomes the mechanism that sustains the mission over the long term. So I guess just going back to your original question, hitting a number and believing in the impact of what I'm selling doesn't feel like a contradiction for me, at least. In fact, I think it reinforces each other.
That point on the sustainable model is So interesting. I do feel that work that does good, in quote comments, it's like held at a very different standard to work that doesn't do good. So, like, to give a completely different example, if you're an oil and gas company, nobody expects you to have, brilliant, perhaps, CSR programs. But if you are a sustainable energy provider, all of a sudden you're under much more scrutiny. And I find that, translates across lots of different roles, whether it's tech for good, the charity sector, etc., that we do hold people who are, again, doing good at a much higher standard.
Absolutely. And I actually learned about this when I did the Cambridge MBA, because we talked about these examples of companies who perhaps had started off as a for-profit and then became a B Corp or a social enterprise and then wanted to have a more impact-led mission. And the result was that they were held to a completely different standard in their operating model. And they were being scrutinized in, how were the sales that they were generating actually leading to X number of dollar impact or ROI? And, actually what was the impact of what they were doing at the end of the day? Because it had become embedded within their mission, they were just reviewed with a completely different lens. And there were also different, perhaps, metrics that they had to report on and be held accountable for. So it is a very fine line to balance. I think it's really hard being a social enterprise. But I also think if you get it right, it can be a really exemplary model of profit and purpose done well.
Super interesting. It very much reminds me in many ways of being a woman in tech or a woman in the workplace, where perhaps you are also held at a different standard that might not always be reflected in the performance rubric.
True.
But speaking of roles, so I know that you've always had, I guess, a bit of a target-driven background, but so there might have been more of a natural progression for you. But for women, say like myself, who perhaps are thinking of moving into sales, what would you tell them what that transition is really like? And I guess, how did you prepare yourself for a more rigorous sales role?
Yeah, very good question. I will say, don't underestimate the skills that you already have and how transferable they can be. Because if you had done other roles like in partnerships, or you had done strategic roles, or even working in other roles like product, there is so much that comes across and can be translated into a sales role. So you've already done the work of building relationships. You've already done the work of trying to influence stakeholders and to communicate value. And that can be pulled across very easily in sales. I think for anyone transitioning into a sales role, or even into generally a different function or role, it is a learning curve. And I've had to really reinvent and upskill myself multiple times in my career. I think what matters the most, and I think you guys would probably you ladies would very much, this would resonate with you, is it's so important to have a growth mindset. Being willing to be uncomfortable for a while, being patient with yourself through that process, and then always staying hungry to master something new, because that's essentially what you're doing, no matter whether you're heading into sales or you're heading into a different type of function. And in these types of roles, especially being a woman in tech, surround yourself by good role models. I've been really fortunate enough to have had female managers, leaders, and mentors, and very successful examples of women who, in leadership, and specifically actually in the tech for good space, the tech and the impact space, who've really showed me how to lead with both ambition and authenticity. And they've informed my own leadership style. And I'm so grateful to those who've actually paved the way for me to also have stepped into the role of being a leader in tech. So I would say, when you're thinking about upskilling yourself, make sure that you're doing it in stages, especially, try to build a network early in sales or in the space that you wanted to enter into. Find those good mentors and leaders that you want to align yourself to. And if there is an opportunity that you've created for yourself, or that someone gives it to you, grab it with both hands, even if you feel like you're not ready for it or that it is intimidating. because that's where, those moments that stretch you, that's where your career really can be shaped in the most meaningful ways.
I love all of that. I took down lots of notes, and it definitely resonates with some of the themes we've heard in the season of, starting before you're ready, and the power of community as well.
Yes.
You touched on it already, but you have reinvented yourself a lot through your career, investment banking, then, more of like a social impact, and now you're on sales. And you've touched on a lot of the things that you've done. I really resonate with developing a growth mindset as being, one of the key levers that we all have. But I'm sure, well articulated and structured as that answer was, there's always like the human part of it when you're in the day to day of going through that process
Yes.
of growth that can be really painful. What was the hardest part of your journey?
I think the hardest part of the journey, and I will be very honest here, is learning to fully believe in myself, especially in environments where not everyone is going to see your value immediately. There will be moments in your career where people doubt you, where people talk over you, where people minimize your perspective, or make you feel like you have to justify why you're in the room. And when you are someone who thinks differently or takes unconventional paths, those moments can feel even more pronounced. And so one of the biggest lessons for me, I think that was one of the hardest parts of the journey. And one of the biggest lessons was just staying grounded in who I am, what I value, even in those situations, and learning not to shrink myself to make other people feel more comfortable. And I think it can be intimidating, to speak up when you do hold a different perspective, particularly as a woman and particularly as a woman of color in high performance environments. But I really do believe that diversity of thought can be a superpower, because often the most valuable contributions are the ones that will challenge the default way of thinking, or ones that will bring a different lens to a conversation. And then another difficult part for me has been, sort of grounded in the leadership aspect. And I can honestly say that my career has flourished under great leaders, but equally it's been held back by poor ones. Leadership has such an enormous impact on whether people feel seen, supported, and able to grow. And that's why, for me, I've become very intentional about the environments that I'm in and the leaders that I align myself with, and even the type of leader that I want to be. Because the right leaders, they don't just manage you, they actually back you, they advocate for you, they stretch you. And in so doing, they will accelerate your trajectory. I think they are the ones that create space for you to be bigger than sometimes you even think you can be. So for ambitious women, I think it's such an important sort of lesson that your environment really does matter. Choosing the leaders and the cultures that genuinely value your voice can completely change the trajectory of your career.
There was so much to unpack in what you just said, Chiara, and I think that's such great advice and I was, nodding, all of it resonated. But one thing I wanted to pick up was what you just said there about the impact that a leader can have on you, that on your career and, the trajectory and all of those things. How do you now, at this stage of your career, kind of assess whether you think the environment or the leader is going to be able to give that to you? Because I can imagine it's hard to tell, in an interview, or, is there a particular question you ask, or how do you get a sense of that?
I would say the biggest thing is to trust your gut, because you can tell, and it's about whether you ignore some of the, I don't know if they call it beige flags, maybe not beige flags, but the flags that are not necessarily flagging up as red for you yet, amber flags, if you would. If you're seeing amber flags, they will turn into red flags for you. And so if there is anything that you're hearing, even in the interview stages, that is cropping up for you as being, doesn't quite seem right, don't ignore it, because it will surface later on in some respect. And I think you can tell genuinely in the way in which you ask questions of, say you're in an interview and you're interviewing with your hiring manager, for example, or even other leaders across the business. What is their leadership style? How do they think about leadership? What is their leadership philosophy? Because you can learn a lot about how they consider what they consider to be leadership, and how, if they can give you examples of how they've also empowered the others around them, I think that's a useful indicator of whether or not this is somebody that you would love to work with, and learn from.
Yeah, great advice. Chiara, we've spoken so much about this, your amazing career, all the things you've done, so much. And I know, you also became a new mom around the time that you joined one of the world's most high-profile tech companies, which is a lot to navigate at once, with everything. What was that period really like for you, and how did you manage that transition back to work while you were, finding your feet in the role of being a mom?
Yeah, it was tough. I will say it was tough. It still is, even though I'm not a new mom. I think you're really, in that newborn phase, and that phase of when your child is very young, you're in a haze of trying to learn how to work a full day while not getting a full night's sleep. And I will be honest, my son is nearly 4, and I'm still not getting 100% of a full night's sleep. But back then, I really had to be patient with myself how, on just demonstrating value quickly, coming back into the role post maternity leave, and while I was even getting used to this new normal. And there were definitely times that it seemed impossible, but I also enjoyed getting to use my brain in a different way, which in itself had completely changed due to being a mum. And I fast learned that actually being a mum made me more efficient. It changed how I approached problems. So in fact, motherhood helped me have a much sharper clarity on the types of roles, the type of impact, the type of leadership teams that I wanted for my career. I think it definitely elevated the way I worked, in that I was faster and more critical. And I do think that there is a narrative that motherhood weakens your professional edge, but for me, it actually strengthened it. And I genuinely believe that being a parent is a superpower, even though it oftentimes doesn't feel like it. But that being said, returning to work is incredibly difficult, especially in tech. You step out for a couple of months, things move so quickly. And you personally, as a new mom, your life has become infinitely more demanding as well. You're stretched in a million directions. And there is also that guilt that is woven throughout all of it. But despite how tough it was, I love this stronger version of myself that motherhood created. And it's expanded me in ways that I hadn't anticipated. And of course, I would choose this reality a million times over.
Thank you for that answer. That's just like, I think it's such a powerful way that you framed it. Again, I don't think I've heard it put in that way before. Joe and I actually debated whether to have this question in, because we often feel sometimes that men in interviews are not asked, the thing about what was it like having a child. But I also know that it's quite important to explain to women who are, working in tech and wanting to be ambitious, also to have people who have navigated this and explain to them. So I think just the way that you framed it, Chiara, about the fact that it's now strengthened almost the way that you think about your career, because you're so much more intentional and efficient and all of these things, is a really interesting and in a way different perspective on it. Although you have also mentioned that it is, exhausting and tiring and all of those things, but it has also helped in many ways. So thank you for sharing that. Chiara, we have one final question for you. We could chat to you for a while, but we are at time. So the last thing we want to find out from you is, what is one piece of advice you'd give to a woman earlier in her career who wants to build something meaningful, not just successful?
I would firstly say, I think you can do both. It's not one or the other. And I think it also depends very much on what you define as success. For a lot of people, sometimes success is having meaning in one's work. And I think that you can have real impact through so many roles and industries and professions. And so I would say for anyone who is trying to do both, first and foremost, find the mission that brings you fulfillment. So really pay attention to the problems that genuinely move you. What do you keep coming back to? What are those conversations that you can't stop having? What are some of the injustices and inefficiencies that frustrate you enough to want to do something about it? And that's where the purpose starts to reveal itself. And then once you've found that, look for the role or the organization or the institution or the path that is going to allow you to support that mission. And that may very well not be a linear journey. As we know, a lot of women and men, I guess, they feel this pressure to have a perfectly mapped out trajectory of career. But I think all of us here know that some of the most important opportunities actually will present itself when you take a non-conventional path and when your priorities evolve over time. And then the last thing I will say is, and we've talked about it before, is just find those good role models and mentors to learn from. There's enough room at the table for all of us. So find the women and the men who are going to be your advocates and who will empower you to get there.
Chiara, I've loved our conversation. I found it just expanded my mind in so many ways and just made me really reconsider things I've been thinking about in my career. So thank you so much for that. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Good question. I think the best way is probably my LinkedIn, and I am connected to both of you, so hopefully folks will be able to find me very easily. But I am always willing to have coffee chats or informational interviews, and I love nothing more than to just spend time gibbering around about tech for good and social impact and how we can deploy technology to help people. And anything outside of that too. So feel free to reach out to me, and I'd love to chat.
Oh, thanks for that. And we'll definitely put your details in the show notes. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. And can I just say a massive thank you to the both of you for just giving me the time and the space to share some of my thoughts. I think, just the both of you are incredibly accomplished women. And I think just giving the forum and the platform for other women to bring their perspective just helps all of us improve a little bit each day. So hopefully we can all take some learnings from all of these conversations and empower each other as we go through our journeys.
Thank you so much, Chiara. That was making me almost like tear up. So thank you.
And I don't know if this is recorded, but just to say, I feel like this is very full circle moment because Jerisha and I go back so many years, decades, really giving away our age there. But it's just been so inspiring watching the both of you do the things that you do. So I can't wait to see the impact that you guys are going to have in another decade of your career.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps others find us. Even better, share it with a friend or colleague who needs to hear this. Thanks, and see you next time.